So hello again. We have been asked to, in addition to our overview to the growth of EMI, we were asked to present on some of the contexts in which we've been working in. So that's what we'll do next in the next 20 minutes. Jim and I have been involved in a number of different projects. Both of us worked in EMI institutions in Japan. I was the EAP coordinator for a bilingual business program before moving to Edinburgh, and Jim worked at Japan's first?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
First EMI?
Japan's first EMI program started in 1949. It was after World War II.
You weren't there then.
And I wasn't there then. No, white hair, but not that old. But yes, I'm going to talk more about some of the specifics from that program in relation to other contexts.
So it's gone. So my work started with a British Council funded study, a comparative study of EMI in Japan and China, and now this project has extended to the Southeast Asian context. So I have a questionnaire circulating around Southeast Asia and an in-depth examination of Thailand and Vietnam, and the funding has been extended, so I'll be going back again in January to collect more data. So I won't be presenting any of the findings from those contexts today, but I'll offer a few insights into what I've observed during the interviews. I've also been involved in consultancy work with the University of Tokyo doing faculty development for EMI. We've developed over 30 MOOCs, massive online open courses. So it's a lot of lectures, and they have quizzes and assignments and everything. So the first module is on English medium instruction, and the second is on global Englishes for EMI, so a more globally orientated approach to English medium instruction. Jim and I are also writing a textbook on EMI for applied linguistics and TESOL programs, and also an edited volume on different approaches to EMI. So we're involved in quite a lot, both collaboratively and individually. And Jim's working on, in Poland?
Yes.
Japan? Yes? Do you want to say that later?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So first of all then, Japan and China. I've already given you some examples in the keynote earlier. As I mentioned, EMI provision in Japan has almost doubled in the last 20 years, but it's certainly not new in the Japanese context, and it does have quite a long history, particularly in the 1980s and 90s with the discourse of Kokusaika, which is internationalization. I have the statistics on my other computer, but the number of Japanese students studying abroad, I think it was something like increased by 500%. And students were going to places like America, the UK, elsewhere, and these universities were calling for partner programs in Japan. They wanted to send their students back to Japan. So there was a need to set up programs that could accommodate international students. Universities in Japan are in fierce competition, and we saw a lot of national universities starting to offer EMI courses, like the private universities, like the one that I worked at in the 1990s. And in the 21st century, with the demands of internationalization and the need for the income generated with international student fees, we've seen a boom in EMI provision. And a string of highly funded government policies.
Yes, so in relation to these policies that Nicola's been talking about, with international students coming in and Japanese students studying abroad, one of the papers that I worked on is published in Higher Education on Japan's Ministry of Education funded policies for internationalization of higher education. We looked at 4 big projects, and the current one, which is the Top Global Universities project, is the one that we focused on. In this diagram that you can see on the screen, this Top Global University project was built on the Go Global Japan project, which was about student mobility. So more of a focus on actually getting Japanese students to study abroad. So Nicola gave you a statistic about the 500% increase in response to internationalization movements when they first started, but that's reversed. So Japanese students aren't studying abroad as much anymore. And this doesn't have anything to do with English language ability or proficiency either. It's another issue that comes up again. But this Top Global University project has been, it's focused on 37 universities, so all of these programs provide funding for select universities. And in these 37 universities, there are 13 that are type A, and they are competing for positions in the top 100 world ranked universities, which a few of them are already in. and Type B universities, which are providing models, examples of internationalized higher education that can then be used across other universities in Japan.
Okay, so I mentioned then that increasing income and compensating for shortages at the domestic level, this is certainly a key driving force in the Japanese context. The Ministry of Education explicitly states this in their policy. They note that the two goals of the higher education policy is, number one, to increase the number of classes taught. They say foreign languages, but this mostly means in English. And second is to increase the ratio of international students. And we saw these highly funded policies. But what is concerning is, as I mentioned in the keynote, the amount of money involved, and universities are only just starting to evaluate their EMI programs. So the University of Tokyo at the moment, in education in general, there's an increased push towards accountability, and universities are being pushed to be accountable now for their funding. So what has been the success of this program, and a lot of the administrators are now looking to curriculum experts to offer advice on how to evaluate their curriculum, because there has been no clear guidelines from the Ministry of Education in how to implement this national policy at the institutional level. As I mentioned, there's a number of key driving forces, but also perceived benefits behind EMI, and I asked students in both Japan and China, why have you enrolled? I also asked the teachers, why did you enroll in this program? And you can see here, so it's small, 40% of the students here enrolled to improve their English proficiency. This was very, very different to how content professors conceptualized EMI in these contexts. I found discrepancies between staff and student attitudes, and also between content professors and EAP practitioners working in these programs. Students saw the purpose. They would place EMI at the English language side of the continuum, and the content professors placed it way towards the other end. They saw their responsibility was solely to deliver the content through English, and that they had no responsibility to help students with their English language. Because of these differing conceptualizations, students saw EMI as a way to improve their English proficiency. They did not want any use of Japanese or Chinese in the class. And if their teacher used their mother tongue, they saw this as a sign of a lack of proficiency. Teachers, on the other hand, because of the students' lower levels of English proficiency and the need to explain difficult concepts about the subject, did transition to the student's mother tongue as a useful pedagogic tool. So we can see here the problems with definitions, and again the need for clear policy statements on the purpose of the programme. And this also relates to language policy as well.
Okay.
And the use of language, sorry.
Okay, this is a little bit of data from a project that I'm doing with British Council China on EMI and higher education there. And it was broken down into different parts: policy, a policy scan, plus questionnaires and interviews. So I'm going to show a little bit of some of the examples from that data, but this is a project that is happening right now, so this is all very fresh data. This interesting graph shows that the development of policy information around EMI programs is shifting its descriptions. So when you look at the universities that are in our data set and their available information about their EMI programs, we see it described in different ways depending on when that information was published. So going back to 2003, 2005, 2006, the earliest ones, or I should say the longest since updated versions, identify EMI as strictly as bilingual. And that's a really interesting initiation to what we understand about EMI programs and what they are. What we then saw over time with those policies and when they were published is that they were being described then as bilingual with English, right, identifying clearly English as that other language. And then most recently, the policy documents that were available from 2019 just as bilingual English and English. So we lose that whole idea of just bilingual and thinking about other languages than English. All right, Nicola's going to talk to you now about Vietnam and Thailand, new contexts that we haven't heard yet.
Okay. Just to go back there, sorry. As Jim mentioned, we have an increase in programs being advertised as all English, but from my observations traveling around Japan and China, EMI is approached in very different ways, and many of the lessons that I observed, there was no English used whatsoever. The entire lesson was in Chinese. The PowerPoint was in English, but the lesson was solely delivered through the medium of Chinese. The international students who did not speak Chinese were very, very concerned that they weren't learning anything on their two-year program abroad as well. So I think we definitely need more research that involves observations as well, just to see how this policy is in fact being implemented in different institutions. So new context then, Vietnam and Thailand, they're very similar in the way that the push towards EMI is strongly related to the government's desire to improve the English proficiency of the citizens, and also very much related to developments in English language teaching as well. And there's a big push in both contexts at the moment. What's interesting from my initial observations as well is EMI has huge educational, societal and economic consequences, and I think this really calls for research into why are we transitioning to English medium instruction and what impact is this having on students' knowledge of their subject, English proficiency, culture, own language. You know, there's a number of different factors. It really struck me in Thailand that the students were very, very aware of their privileged status. EMI programs in Thailand are twice, if not 3 times, the price of the Thai equivalents. And the students were very concerned that EMI was widening the gap in society. And this came up in nearly all student interviews in Thailand. I mean, I've only done about 25 just now, but it really struck me in that context. In the teacher interviews, a lot of the Thai professors were very, very concerned. They were being pressured to transition to, I mean, we have Nobel Prize winning professors suddenly told you have to start teaching in English. One Thai traditional architecture lecturer had to change the whole course to Southeast Asian architecture because he said he simply could not teach Thai traditional architecture in English. You know, there wasn't the vocabulary, materials. I remember talking to students in Thailand that were studying food science. All the materials were about bread and pasta. There was no materials suitable for learning about Thai food in English. So they were concerned that after graduation, they would not be able to work in Thailand. So when we think about employability, I think that these are questions and concerns that we have to think about. Poland.
Okay. So looking for a kind of shift away from these contexts that are very much policy driven. So the responses are to larger policy decisions about EMI implementation, talking to academic staff and students in East Asia and in Southeast Asia. A lot of the response is how do we deal with what our universities are requiring from us now and what our ministries are requiring from us now. I'm also looking at a context that doesn't have the same ministry funding, right? So what we're seeing is quite a lot of investment in East Asia and Southeast Asia with these top-down policies that we don't then see in policies that I'm finding in Central Europe. And in particular, I'm focusing on Poland, which is the largest population and largest country in the EU 13 countries. And that's the reason why I'm focusing on Poland here. Something that's interesting about the understanding around internationalization in Poland is they're drawing on this inspiration that comes from Northern Europe, a lot of what Andrew was talking about, and the Netherlands, where we see English being used regularly, right? Not just in these classrooms. In Poland, that is something that is happening, right? Part of the EU means that there's more mobility happening there. Polish history means that additional languages were German at one point, Russian, right, at another point, and now only more recently English. But what that means is that you have a lot of students and teachers able to use English without any top-down policy saying that you need to study and learn in English. As a result, sort of grassroots, more organic, bottom-up approaches to English implementation can be found in these contexts. And this is something that is interesting for me to think about in relation to what's happening in EMI implementation in Central Asia, for example. How much of this is a response to changes in a focus on English? Right? When we look at the statistics here in Uzbekistan, realizing that the percentage of Russian that happens here is where it is, adding English then to that, are we recognizing that these multilingual settings and multilingual functioning is something that's a benefit to what's happening, or are we seeing it as some kind of issue or problem? So in internationalization in Poland, what is available is fairly open, right? And it's meant to provide opportunities for interpretation. So there are scoring systems for universities to describe themselves as international. And there's 7 pillars for them. 2 of them are focused on studying in a foreign language. And the general understanding is that that foreign language will be English. There are 4 pillars on international exchange of students and academic staff. Now, this is an interesting one given that Poland has the lowest of the EU 13 countries of the percentage of international students there. And interestingly, their largest group of international students come from the Ukraine. So the movement there of students is a lot of it are English-speaking students from Poland then going to other places, particularly universities in Vienna and Prague. The other pillar is multiculturality of student community. All right, so there's a bit of a recognition here that diversity is a positive thing, but it's not necessarily something that's realized in that particular specific context. You'll notice a name that keeps popping up. This is my student, Agata Mikołajewska, and she's doing her PhD on EMI in higher education in Poland. She's also a research assistant on a project of mine, which is focusing on academic funding applications in the EU 13 countries, and in particular looking at their funding for looking at applications for EU funding, so applying in English. A few things that we were able to connect between that project and her PhD study. One that's pretty important is the idea of EMI has no translation in Polish because there's no policy for it. It is interpreted inconsistently. In general, people, when discussing EMI, are often talking about English language education. English is a burden for academic staff due to administration with low English proficiency. So being able to teach in English, being able to complete forms in English, being able to do things in English in higher education is always going to be harder when your administrative staff don't have the English proficiency to support you. Teaching content in English leads to a lack of depth of knowledge and understanding. Now, this is an issue that we've talked about with a few people that's a dilemma. When students are studying content in English, is it possible, and in our data we're seeing that people are saying this, that they're not learning as much, right? If they were studying in the local language, would their understanding be deeper? Would it be richer, right? Would they have more content knowledge? If we're restricting things to English only, we could be potentially limiting them from their depth, from achieving particular depth of knowledge. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. Part of it, as Andrew pointed out in the study, 22% slower, right, in terms of the actual delivery of content in English versus delivery of content in the first language. So the amount of time that you can spend on something is restricted by the use of English. Access to materials, right? In Poland, and similar to the situation in Vietnam and in Thailand, access to materials was a problem. We had to borrow a lot of materials from other places, from other contexts that didn't fit, right, that continue not to fit the local contexts. So all of this is coming together into a focus on the English obstacle in this part of the world. All right, so a bit on the common issues that we find between all these different contexts. I'm going to turn this back over to Nicola. This is a slide that you'll recognize from earlier.
I think it's me next to
yeah.
Okay, so we've only got a few, I think about 3 slides. I'm very aware that it's nearly lunchtime and you've also been listening to us for quite a while now. I just wanted to show this slide again because I do think it's important just to show that we have found varying approaches to how this policy is being implemented at the institutional level, which is concerning given the link between EMI and the desire to improve English proficiency. In some universities there was very, very little support. Also very different views among staff and students on who should provide support. The students in my studies have all noted that they want their content professors to also help them with their English and academic skills, as I mentioned, yet content professors don't think that they have that skill set and that is not their responsibility. Students called for a lot more support as well, and the EAP instructors all called for more collaboration with the content professors, which was one of the reasons behind the establishment of the network as well. I wanted to show you this example. This is a university that I worked at in Japan, and I mentioned this is the institutional support model, and I mentioned that this is almost a sheltered approach to EMI, so a more clue-based approach. So in the first year here, students have EAP 1, English for Academic Purposes, where they take general academic skills classes. In the second year, they do this more intensively in the first semester of their second year, 3 times a week. And all of our EAP materials were developed in-house and related to the student's major. In the universities I visited, in my research, only one other university had tailor-made materials. Students were very, very dissatisfied with the general EAP courses. They wanted more ESP. Okay, so I think that the growth in EMI is going to have an impact on the EAP industry, but more specifically ESP, and Jim started researching this as well. So we can see here in this university, the students then transitioned from EAP to start doing more content-based classes, ESP, and then they had their full EMI, 70% of the courses in their third year and fourth year when EMI. From my experience, this worked very, very well, and I think this was quite a good model to introduce students to studying through English. So we just wanted to end with a few key points on some of our findings. You were going to introduce students?
we don't really, we're going to have to wrap this up. Otherwise.
1 minute.
All right, so yeah, the EMI challenges that we see are similar between the context for local and international students. So when we look at making suggestions about what we can do here, we need to draw on the relationship between what we understand about all these different contexts, between disciplines, between national contexts.
Stay on students.
Oh, okay.
And just with regards to international students, my own research in Japan with international students has found significant rates of dissatisfaction. The students feel very isolated and they don't feel that their needs are being met. And they're very, very aware that the universities need the income. And I was quite surprised at this, and I think we have to be wary of, UK universities, for example, have been heavily criticised for the focus on international student revenue without meeting the needs of the international cohort. And I think this is going to be a growing area of concern with EMI. With teaching, we've found common challenges between EAP and the content practitioners. We have to think about EMI teacher competency, proficiency, training. We don't have time to go into that in detail, but I think it's important to point out that being a competent EMI teacher definitely does not only involve being competent in the English language, it involves much more in teaching in an internationalized environment. And I do think this lack of collaboration is quite a key concern. This was just some examples from students. This was your...
Okay, and just to close with, this is one of the issues that we've been talking about quite a lot, and it's how we approach and understand the way that we contextualize EMI. A really much more valuable approach rather than national context is to think about these different levels, macro level, meso level, micro level. And when we look at the kinds of research and investigation that we can do at these different levels, we can see where we can make better connections across these levels rather than trying to make connections between institution types or indeed national contexts. So that is all we wanted to say about that. All right.
And I still have a questionnaire open. So if you are working in a university on an EMI program, I'd be delighted to hear your views. So this is a link to the questionnaire, and this will really help inform our work as well. Thank you very much.